Hello everyone, this is Robert and this is the Creality Ender-3 S1 Plus 3D printer. I'm really excited to do this review because I think this could be a good alternative for a lot of people. They're kind of looking at the Prusa MK3S but don't really want to drop $1,000 on it. This is a lot cheaper and offers a lot of the same benefits. So let's get into it. Print quality, ease of use, features, all that good stuff. And please feel free to use the chapters down below to skip around, and I won't be offended if you go straight to the conclusion. So let's get started and figure out what the S1 Plus is and kind of where that sits in Ender's lineup. Okay, so what exactly is the S1 Plus? This is a relatively new printer, so I kind of had to do a little bit of research to figure out where this sits in their lineup. Previously, you had the S1. The S1 is basically a smaller version of this, but it doesn't have the touchscreen. It has like the little knob operation. That is a 220 by 220 by 270 build volume, where this is a 300 by 300 by 300. So this is about 100% or double the build volume of the original S1, and you have the addition of the touchscreen instead of the knob interface. Then you also have the S1 Pro, and the S1 Pro does have the touchscreen but also has an all-metal hot end and has the little light bar at the top, and once again that is the 220 by 220 by 270 build volume. So it kind of sits somewhere in the middle. It shares I guess the touchscreen with the S1 Pro. None of them have the build volume. It has the bigger build volume obviously, but it shares many of the other parts of the standard S1, which is kind of confusing. The standard S1 is $400, the S1 Pro is $480, and this sits right now at about $529 or $530. So it's definitely the most expensive of all three of them, but it also is the only one to have the expanded build volume, which, like I said, is about double what the others are. All three of these have the sprite extruder, which is actually pretty darn good. We'll get into that later. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea where this thing sits. You're definitely paying a premium for the extra build volume, but I think they're going to be very similar otherwise. So if you're watching this review and trying to figure out like what the Pro would be or what the standard S1 would be, really there's not that much different other than just the size, the all-metal hot end, the light bar that sits on the Pro, and then the touchscreen and the knob. Those are kind of the only differences between those. So hopefully that makes sense. So that leads us into the kind of the quick down and dirty overview of what this is, features and specs wise. It does have the new sprite extruder, which I really, really like. It actually is a very, very nice overall extruder. It isn't like really a high flow extruder or anything like that. It's pretty, standard off the shelf. This one is not an all metal hot end, even though they kind of say that it has dual metal gears. That is just the extruder gears that are pulling the filament down in. And that is obviously a direct drive. It also has like a BL Touch sort of thing, except for its CR Touch. It's basically their rip-off of the BL Touch. So it does have full bed leveling. It does have the removable flexible build plate, which is kind of cool. Not as nice as what something like the Prusa has, which is the powder-coated steel plate. It's a steel plate with essentially a sticker on top. So it's nice, it's good, but it's not as good as the powder-coated textured plates that I tend to always use. Has the touch screen, has nice belt tension adjustments on the Y-axis and the X-axis, and then you got a filament runout sensor, power recovery, all that good stuff, all the stuff that you would definitely expect to see at a printer at this price point. Some things that you don't expect to see at a printer at this price point are the little springy adjustable wheels for the bed. I feel like I'm one of the only people that hate those and think that they just need to go away and think that they have no place. They exist on these. They're a little bit nicer because they're anodized aluminum, but it still exists. Other than that, it's pretty much your standard printer. Of course, it's got, silent stepper drives, all that good stuff. Pretty much everything now has that. I'm probably not going to review it if it doesn't. So yeah, that's pretty much what we're looking at. Let's go straight into the tests. So the first category is ease of use. How easy is it to just get this thing in the mail, open it up, and within a couple hours be doing your first print? Printers have come a long way in the past few years, and the Creality Ender series has done a really good job at getting a lot of beginners into 3D printers. They have a massive community. It's probably only second to Prusa's community, and so overall I give this a 7 out of 10. I did run into a couple little hiccups with assembly. During shipping, the little spring tension wheel things actually had come off, so I had to kind of put those on there, and that was a little bit of an interesting thing. And the eccentric nuts were not adjusted whatsoever. If anyone doesn't know, there's an eccentric nut, which is basically an off-centered nut for these wheels that things glide along in the Y and the X axis, and when they're off-center, it just kind of wobbles around, so you need to turn them and it twists in, and that takes up your slot. That's maybe not something that a beginner would think to do, but I mean, it was pretty floppy, pretty wobbly. They include the wrench. It was just a matter of turning that in. It's just kind of weird because usually that comes pre-adjusted from the factory, and it was really off. It wasn't even close. So that was kind of interesting, but this is also like, you know, first release of these. I'm sure it will get better. Ender knows what they're doing with shipping printers, or Creality knows what they're doing with shipping printers. So 7 out of 10. It also includes its own custom branded Cura slicing software. The instructions were decent. I really had no issue getting this up to, you know, getting that first print. I didn't have any failed print other than this one is failing right now, but that's okay. We'll talk about that later. Yeah, so overall, very good, very beginner friendly, decent manual, decent assembly instructions, good community, included slicer. The only thing that's, you know, bringing this down is the bed leveling. It's a relatively manual process. I've done a lot of this over the years, so I know exactly what to do. The instructions are clear, but it still takes a little bit of time, and you still have to manually do it. This isn't a printer where you just literally plug it in and hit go and it prints. Something like, you know, Bamboo Labs is promising, but there is some manual intervention, and you do have to mess with these spring terminals, and you have to mess with it a little bit. So yeah, 7 out of 10, I'm comfortable with that. So my next category is flexibility. Flexibility is kind of like features, but it's really like, what can you do with this thing out of the box? This is a pretty standard single extruder Y-axis bed slinger. It is a direct drive, so you can print flexibles, but other than that, you know, there's nothing really special. It does not have a hardened nozzle. It does not have an all-metal hot end. You would have to upgrade that, so you're not going to be able to print your nylons or your ABSs or anything like that. It doesn't have a heated enclosure. Once again, single extruder. It's not an IDEX, anything like that. So I'm giving it a 6 out of 10 just simply because it doesn't really have any of these other features. It does get some extra points for having the flexible build platform and also being the 300 by 300 by 300. So you do have that going for it, but other than that, it is pretty standard in terms of what you can do with this printer. It is just your standard single extruder. And for all of these categories, I'm basing them kind of 5 is average. Anything above that is above average. Anything below that is below average. So I think this is slightly above average for the flexible build platform, the direct drive extruder, and the build volume. So the next category before we get to print quality is user experience. These are features or little things about the printer that aren't really necessary, but make using it a lot better. Think of quality of life improvements. And this printer has a few of them. You have a nice touchscreen interface, and it is actually pretty easy to use. A lot of the touchscreen interfaces I've used previously have really been lacking, and they've missed a lot of features, and they're kind of cumbersome to use. This one isn't that bad. It's decent. I would definitely like to see some improvements on it. Just as an example, if I want to adjust the feed rates on this, I kind of have to go into the settings, whatever, go into feed rate, and then it just brings up a box where I just type in a number and then hit enter. That's kind of interesting. I like the idea of just having a wheel to where you can just adjust the wheel. It's just kind of personal preference. It's not bad by any means, but it's maybe not as intuitive as it could be. It does have its own slicer, which is always a nice feature. And with Creality, you know that it's going to be updated and they're going to, keep making improvements on it. I don't think the slicer is as good as the Prusa slicer. That's just a personal preference. I think it kind of lags behind a little bit. but overall it's good. I think the only big negative I have for it is these little adjustment wheels. These things do tend to, you know, rattle loose a little bit if you bump the printer. It's just, I would rather it be a rigid platform that was mounted on. The flexible build platform is not as nice as some of the powder-coated spring textured steel that I've seen before. What was the other thing? The little eccentric nut rubber rollers that are going on the extrusion. Not my favorite. Those things do wear down. They do kind of get dust in your printer. If you use this thing a lot, they do wear off a little bit. You're going to have to adjust them. You don't really know that they need to be adjusted until they need to be adjusted, but all the other quality of life stuff is there. You have the filament sensor, the auto power off, the firmware is most likely going to get updates. People are going to write custom firmware updates, and it has like a little drawer in front for storing things. It's overall very good, but it just does, in my opinion, lag behind the Prusa MK3 just for the little bit of fit and finish. Yes, it has a cool color touchscreen, but I still prefer using the really old school character display on my Prusa because, quite frankly, it has more options in it. There are certain things you just can't even do with this printer. So 7 out of 10, I feel pretty good with that. Out of all the printers I've reviewed recently, this has probably been the best to use. It is similar, I think, to my Mark III in terms of just overall usability. So one last note that I forgot to add in terms of quality of life. This printer is actually relatively loud. You've been watching it this whole time and you've been like, oh, that's really quiet. I've got a noise filter on, so let me turn that off. And that's what it sounds like. The actual stepper drivers themselves, the motors are silent, but the fans are loud. And I don't generally care too much about the loudness of a printer because it should be loud. It has fans and it's heating plastic and all this good stuff. I don't really care that much about it, but no, this is probably one of the louder printers I've actually reviewed. The fans are very aggressive, which they should be, and this is what it sounds like. It's pretty loud, if that is a concern of yours. So for print quality, we're obviously concerned with how well this thing prints because that's ultimately the thing that we're trying to do. I am giving this one an 8.5, which is a half a point higher than I've given my Mark III's. This is the best print quality I've ever seen with the test prints that I'm doing. Now keep in mind I'm using the exact same filament as close to possible for the slicer profiles. I'm drying the filament, all that good stuff. And in this case, I'm actually still using the same spool that I've done for every single one of my printer tests. So I'll show you here in a second what the prints look like. But ultimately, this printer has better fine detail, better overhangs, but it's slightly worse in the overall accuracy of the print. So pretty impressive feat to actually edge out the Mark III. So let's go take a look at these prints side by side. The extruder on this is fantastic. I think they did a really good job with the sprite. So let's look at the test prints. So I'm going to start here with the Matterhackers Astronaut, and I printed the scale wrong, but that's okay. This is the Ender, and then this one is the Prusa Mark III. And the only thing to really note on this is I've always kind of had a little bit of an issue with the hands because it's a little bit of a overhang there, and the Ender did a fantastic job with it. Almost no issues whatsoever. The feet are perfect. It's just a really nice looking print. The visor, the helmet, very clean. Very impressive overall. But this print typically does pretty good on just about whatever I put on. The only issue I've ever had is just that little section on the hands. Moving on. So of course we have to talk about the Benchy. There's really not a lot to talk about though. They're pretty identical. I don't know if you could pick one out over the other. Let's see. This one is the Mark III and this one is the Ender. They're pretty much the same. I think 3D printers have moved to a point to where anyone that's properly calibrated can kind of do these without an issue. So they both look pretty similar. I don't really see any major issues with either of these. Everything came out pretty okay. So this 3D printer test is where we start to see some differences. I've got the Mark III on this side and the Ender on that side. And if you look really closely, the text is just a lot cleaner on the Ender. It's maybe not all that visible on camera, but there's just a little bit less ringing and just a little bit cleaner overall. If we look at the back side and look at the fine details down here, they're both very, very good, which this is usually where a lot of printers fail, especially on, what is it, this side right here with these little openings. This is where some other printers have kind of had some missteps. But the thing that's really impressive here is if we look at these overhangs. This one is the Ender, and you can see it really doesn't start on this side. It really doesn't start to degrade until the very end. That's at like 60 degrees. I need to keep moving over here. And if we look at this other side, you know, it starts to have some issues, but generally speaking, it's really good up until what, about like right there, and that's once again about the 60 degrees. If we look at the Prusa, we're starting to get some blobbing and some issues all the way back at 40. And same on this other side, about right there is when we're having some issues. That's around, yeah, about 40 degrees. So it's kind of a better look at it. They're both pretty good, but if you look at like that edge, you can see that it's having issues all the way down here, kind of at the bottom is where it's starting to have issues. But on the Ender, not really having any severe issues until we get almost to the upper side of it. And some of these really small details are always really difficult. No issues there. How do I rotate this for the... Yeah, the bridging is really solid. This is just very well done. This is the best I've ever seen this print. The Mark III is very close behind, but it's just not as good overall as the Ender-3 S1 Plus. And lastly, we have the Maker's Muse Clearance Castle. This is a really good print to test clearances and just kind of overall print quality. We've got the Ender here on this side and the Prusa over here on this side. And if we look at the little drawbridge gate, we can see that the fine detail's just a little bit better here, and the overhang is better than on the Prusa. It kind of gets away from it a little bit up there. We can see on the back side, the bridging is just a lot nicer. That little bridge there is really, really clean, a little bit saggy on the Mark III. But the big difference here, which I think is very interesting, so this drawbridge kind of comes down, and then we have this little gate. It's pretty well locked in place on the Ender, but is completely free on the Prusa. And once again, same settings, dehydrated filament, same spool, all that good stuff. This one is just super, super smooth. It doesn't rub. It's completely free and we can operate it just fine. And this one is just a little bit more rough and just doesn't feel as good. And this gate thing is just a lot more rough in there. So overall, the Ender is going to have better fine details, better bridging, and better overhangs, but the Prusa is going to have an overall better accuracy, and it's going to be better for print in place and close tolerances. So the last and final category is value. And for this, I'm actually using a formula that I came up with that takes into consideration how well it scored and also what the price is. The reason I do this is if you had just an absolute pile of garbage that was just a 1 all the way across, but was $200, is it really that good of a value if it's just junk? So the higher it scores, the more it kind of offsets that price, because you know, something that's $1,000 like the Mark III, if it's at the top of its category, yeah, maybe it is worth that. So there is kind of a little bit of a calculation being done there. But at 8.84, it definitely shows that at $500, this is a pretty good value considering that it comes very close in most categories to the $1,000 Mark III S, which has a significantly lower value score. I think if we look at this one versus the standard S1 and also the S1 Pro, this is probably the least value of the three. But if you want that extra build volume, which is double the build volume of the other two, then you're just going to get this one for the bigger build volume. If you want an all-metal hot end and you want more versatility to print more materials, you should be looking at the S1 Pro. And if you just want the ultimate in budget, I would look at the $400 S1. The S1 is going to have the same performance overall. You might lose a couple quality of life features with the lack of the touchscreen, maybe not. But I think that's going to be kind of the highest value. At $400 to get this kind of print quality, it's going to be really hard to go wrong with that one. And obviously, if you want the bigger one, get the Plus. And if you just kind of want the best all around, maybe go with the Pro. All right, so conclusion time. For anyone that's just jumping straight ahead to this, welcome to the video. How you doing? I think in conclusion, this is a fantastic printer for the price. I think overall the MK3S is just a little bit better and more polished and has, better quality of life features. The textured bed is better. Swapping out filament is just easier. The filament sensor being inside the head is better. The menu system is better. The slicer workflow is better. Everything is better. But is it double better? And I think that's the thing that only you can answer. For me, I'm not going to sell my Mark III and get one of these in place of it. It's not going to happen. I still really do enjoy the Mark III, even though this has slightly better print quality overall. The workflow and the reliability of my Mark3S is just really hard to challenge. However, having a second or a third printer to augment a Mark III, absolutely. I would not get two Mark IIIs. I would get one and then maybe one of these as a backup. I think that would be a really, really nice setup to have. And if you are budget constrained in any way, looking at the standard S1 or even the S1 Pro, just to bring that budget down, if you don't need this extra size, going with one of those would be fantastic. So I think overall, fantastic extruder, pretty good build quality overall, and it really isn't lacking anything that you might need. So many of these other printers are lacking bed leveling, or they're lacking the touch probe, or they're lacking just some other feature that really in 2022 you should have. So the fact that this kind of has everything that you need and is in that $500 price point for that kind of level of quality, yeah, highly, highly recommended. Really, really pleased with this thing overall. So as always, thanks for watching. Check out the links down below. That's how the lights stay on. So yeah, hopefully you got something out of this, and see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.